Why Leonor's marriage could trigger crisis. Dawn breaks over Madrid before the city fully wakes. Stone facades hold the nights cold. Flags hang still. Inside the architecture of the state, continuity is already at work. For Princess Leonor of Spain, the future does not arrive suddenly. It advances slowly, measured, recorded, prepared for years before it is ever revealed. She is young, disciplined, and carefully framed by the institution she will one day embody. But her personal timeline does not belong to her alone. It never has. Because in Spain, monarchy is not sustained by affection or spectacle. It survives through constitutional consent. Through balance. Through restraint. For Princess Leonor of Spain, marriage is not a private choice. It is a constitutional fault line, capable of uniting a nation or tearing it apart. This is the living thread of continuity. And it is far more fragile than it appears. The Spanish crown does not rest on romance. It rests on law, on precedent, on the quiet agreement between institutions that stability is worth preserving, even when it demands personal sacrifice. Spain remembers what instability feels like, not as distant history, but as inherited memory. Civil fracture, exile, the long shadow of dictatorship. A monarchy restored not by passion, but by necessity. And so every visible gesture matters. Every absence is noted. Every future decision is evaluated not for its emotional truth, but for its institutional consequence. At first glance, the question of marriage seems almost ordinary. A human inevitability, a future footnote, but what most observers misunderstand is this. The crown does not ask whether Leonor will marry. It asks whom she will align Spain with when she does. Here is the first uncomfortable truth. The greatest risk is not scandal. It is legitimacy. Because legitimacy, once questioned, does not collapse loudly. It erodes, quietly, systematically, until one day, it is simply no longer there. This is where the audience often leans in, expecting gossip, expecting intrigue, but the real tension is structural. Spain is a parliamentary monarchy. The crown reigns, but does not rule. Yet its symbolic authority anchors the entire system. Remove confidence in that anchor, and the structure above begins to sway. 2 minutes in, the illusion breaks. This is not about love. It never was. The constitutional framework surrounding the Spanish monarchy treats succession as a matter of national security. Marriage, therefore, becomes an act of statecraft. A declaration of alignment, a signal to allies and skeptics alike. In Washington, the question would not be romance. It would be predictability, stability, whether Spain's institutional voice remains consistent across decades. In London, the analysis would be colder still. They understand this terrain. A royal marriage is not a personal chapter. It is a geopolitical paragraph. Canada and Australia would watch differently. From a distance, but not without memory. They know how symbolic fractures travel faster than legal ones. Germany would observe through the lens of constitutional endurance, asking whether Spain's system remains disciplined enough to absorb pressure without theatrical collapse. None of these actors need explanation. They read institutions fluently. The words return because the stakes have deepened. Not because of a decision already made, but because of the narrowing space in which any decision can exist. By minute 5, the tension is no longer speculative. It is procedural. There are expectations written and unwritten. Cultural boundaries that appear flexible until they are tested. Political factions waiting, not for failure, but for opportunity. A future consort would not simply join a family. They would enter the constitutional bloodstream of the state. And here, something remains deliberately unspoken. Spain has not publicly articulated its red lines. Not fully, not clearly. This silence is strategic. It allows adaptability, but it also conceals pressure. At minute 8, the mystery sharpens. Why so little clarity? Why the careful absence of guidance? Because once rules are spoken aloud, they become enforceable. And enforcement invites confrontation. The monarchy has learned that survival depends on ambiguity. Just enough to maneuver, never enough to provoke. But ambiguity cannot hold forever. Between minutes 10 and 11, a strain becomes visible. Not dramatic, not public, institutional. Spain's political landscape is fragmented. Coalitions are temporary. Consensus is brittle. In such an environment, the crown is expected to be the one constant. The one figure beyond contestation. A marriage that fractures public perception, even symbolically, risks collapsing that final pillar of neutrality. And neutrality, once lost, is almost impossible to reclaim. At minute 14, the point of no return approaches. Not as an event, but as inevitability. Because time itself is now exerting pressure. Preparation becomes expectation. Expectation becomes demand. The nation begins to ask questions it once avoided. Not aloud, but collectively. Who does she represent? Whose values will she visibly carry forward? And what does that say about Spain itself? This is where identity and governance intertwine. National identity is woven into these rituals, into the optics of continuity, into the careful choreography of tradition. By minute 19, the future threat is no longer abstract. It is not rebellion. It is not revolution. It is disengagement, a quiet withdrawal of belief, a subtle loosening of the bond between institution and citizen. History shows that monarchies do not usually fall when challenged head-on. They fade when they are no longer felt to matter. The phrase lands differently now. Heavier, less dramatic, more precise. Because the crisis is not whether a wedding will happen. It is whether the institution can absorb modern expectation without dissolving its own authority. Spain stands at a familiar edge. Between adaptation and dilution, between visibility and restraint. Continuity is not abstract here, it is embodied in visible presence. In silence, in patience, in decisions delayed until the last possible moment. As the final moments settle, one truth remains. Nothing has happened yet, and that is precisely the danger. The crown still holds, the system still functions, the future remains undecided, and somewhere between duty and desire, between symbolism and sovereignty, history is waiting to see whether stability can survive the next human choice. The question lingers, unanswered, as Spain moves forward, aware that what comes next has not yet been decided. The quiet does not mean safety. It means pressure is being managed. Behind palace walls and parliamentary language, the institution has entered its most delicate phase, anticipation. Not planning, not announcement, anticipation, because once expectation crystallizes, control narrows. For the Spanish crown, the greatest threat has never been public opposition. It has been misalignment, between law and perception, between tradition and timing. This is where the weight shifts upward. From the heir, to the system around her. From Princess Leonor, to King Felipe VI. Felipe understands something Spain learned the hard way. A monarchy does not survive by insisting. It survives by calibrating. His reign has been defined by containment, measured appearances, carefully rationed symbolism, an almost deliberate absence of spectacle. That restraint was not weakness. It was repair. After years, in which confidence fractured, the crown recentered itself as an institutional referee rather than a personal dynasty. That choice stabilized Spain, but it also raised the cost of any future deviation. Because now, neutrality is the brand. And brands are unforgiving. The moment Leonor's private future intersects visibly with public identity, that brand is tested. Not because the public demands perfection, but because it demands coherence. At this stage, the crown is not asking whether a marriage could provoke controversy. It is asking whether it could be interpreted as preference. Preference implies bias. Bias undermines arbitration, and arbitration is the monarchy's last irreplaceable function. This is the structural tension that deepens after the midpoint. Spain's political system no longer relies on overwhelming consensus. It relies on managed disagreement, regional identity, ideological fragmentation, generational divergence. In this environment, the monarch is not expected to inspire, only to endure. That endurance depends on one condition. The crown must never appear to choose sides, socially, culturally, or symbolically. A royal marriage is not read as affection. It is read as alignment. And alignment invites interpretation far beyond Spain's borders. In Washington, such a moment would be assessed for long-term predictability. Would Spain remain institutionally steady through transition? Or would symbolic disruption echo through governance? In London, the reading would be sharper. They have lived through this exact inflection point. They know how swiftly public sentiment can pivot once symbolism feels out of step with continuity. Germany would look for discipline. Not emotion, not narrative, discipline. Canada and Australia would observe the tone rather than the detail. Is the institution still leading quietly, or reacting visibly? These are not emotional judgments. They are institutional diagnostics. And this is where the point of no return becomes visible, not dramatic, but procedural. Because at a certain moment, non-decision itself becomes a decision. Delay protects flexibility, but delay also accumulates expectation. Spain has reached the phase where silence no longer reads as neutrality. It begins to read as uncertainty. The monarchy understands this risk intimately. That is why signals are being managed with almost surgical care. Public appearances, language, absence, every frame matters. The deeper truth, rarely spoken aloud, is this. The crown does not fear controversy. It fears precedent. One exception becomes reference. One deviation becomes argument. And arguments, once constitutional, never fully disappear. This is why the institution moves slowly now. Why every possible future is stress-tested before it is even imagined publicly. By now, the phrase has lost its sensational edge. It has become diagnostic. Because the crisis would not be sudden. It would be cumulative. A gradual weakening of the unspoken contract between crown and citizen. A subtle recalibration of relevance. History shows that when monarchies misjudge these moments, they rarely collapse immediately. They persist, hollowed, contested, tolerated rather than trusted. Spain cannot afford that version of survival. The monarchy's purpose is not to exist. It is to stabilize. And stabilization requires sacrifice that is never applauded. As this second phase closes, nothing is resolved. That is intentional. The institution is still absorbing the future before allowing it to arrive. Still weighing continuity against inevitability. What remains clear is this. The decision, when it comes, will not be framed as personal. It will be presented as inevitable. As aligned. As necessary. Because in Spain, necessity is the crown's strongest language. And, somewhere ahead, not yet visible, not yet named, the next moment of history is already forming, waiting to see whether continuity can hold. When the private becomes unavoidably public, the institution now stands where it always does at the end of every reign in waiting. At the boundary between preparation and exposure. For Princess Leonor of Spain, the future is no longer theoretical. It is approaching at institutional speed. Slow enough to feel controlled. Fast enough to remove comfort. What matters now is not the decision itself. It is the frame around it. Because the crown understands something modern politics often forgets. Events do not destabilize systems. Interpretations do. A marriage announced too plainly risks looking casual. Too carefully, and it appears calculated. Too late, and it reads as hesitation. Too soon, and it invites scrutiny before legitimacy is ready to absorb it. There is no neutral timing. Only managed consequence. This is why the monarchy speaks less as the moment draws nearer. Why visibility is rationed. Why expectation is allowed to rise without direction. The silence is not emptiness. It is ballast. Across the Atlantic, observers in the United States would not ask whether Spain remains a monarchy. They would ask whether it remains predictable. In the United Kingdom, the question would be sharper. Has the institution preserved distance from the personal? Or allowed the personal to reshape the institution? Germany would look for continuity without improvisation. Canada and Australia would look for steadiness without spectacle. None of them would say this publicly. They would not need to. Because credibility is never debated aloud. It is either assumed, or quietly withdrawn. This is the final truth that settles over the crown now. The monarchy does not need approval. It needs acceptance. Acceptance that it still belongs above preference. Above fashion. Above reaction. If that acceptance holds, the system survives almost any single decision. If it fractures, even perfect decisions lose their power. At the end, the phrase no longer sounds like a warning. It sounds like a test. Not of character, not of love, but of whether an ancient institution can still translate private human life into public stability. Without losing itself in the process. Spain waits, not anxiously, precisely, because history here does not announce itself. It advances quietly, through choices framed as inevitability, through continuity defended by restraint. Nothing has broken, nothing has been declared, and that is how moments like this always end. Not with resolution, but with awareness. The awareness that when the decision finally emerges into view, it will not simply shape a life. It will reveal whether the crown still knows how to survive the future. By choosing exactly when to let it arrive.